from her childhood. Let me say I got it here. That I'm being recorded. As Jessica knows, not happily.
Thank you.
So Eudora knew New Orleans well. They'd gone there. She, as an adult, would take the Rebel down there to New Orleans. It figures as a setting in The Robber Bridegroom and No Place for You, My Love, which begins in Galatoire's, in The Optimist's Daughter, and of course in The Purple Hat. And it's an appropriate locale for this story because New Orleans, of course, always is seen as a kind of place of license, of greater freedom. And it's also, as Leota says, and Why I Live at the PO, a place where everybody believes everything's spooky. So here is New Orleans as our setting. Eudora wrote the story probably in late February 1941, and her agent, Dermot Russell, sent it to the New Yorker on March the 4th, 1941. The New Yorker turned it down. It went to the Atlantic, which turned it down. It went to Harper's, which turned it down. It went back to the Atlantic, which turned it down again. And then it went to Harper's Bazaar, and they took it on July 1st, 1941, and it was published in November 41 in Harper's Bazaar. This is a kind of interesting sidelight, and I've gone down this track the last couple of days, so I'm going to take you down it too, although it is a sidelight. Henry Miller, when he got a contract to write The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, he signed that contract with an editor at Doubleday named John Woodburn, who in January 1941 would sign a contract with one Eudora Welty for her first book. And John Woodburn had been to Jackson in 39 in the fall and met Eudora, really liked her. He put her in touch with Dermot Russell, who became her agent. So anyway, Henry Miller in the October 1940 signs a contract with Doubleday to do The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, and he's going to travel all over the country and write up his travels in this book. So he wrote to Eudora. John Woodburn said, you know, if you're going to go to Mississippi, you could go see Eudora Welty. Now, I don't know when he said that to him, but he said it to him, and he wrote to Eudora, and he said he would be coming and he would like to meet her. And by the way, if she needed to make some fast money, he knew some pornographic publishers who would be glad to take a story from her. So Eudora shows this letter to her mother, who says, when that man comes to Jackson, he will not come in this house. So she was forbidden to have him. Well, he came to Jackson probably in early March of 1941. He had been in New Orleans. He'd been out in New Iberville. He went up to Natchez. Then his father died, and he went back to New York, and he spent a month in New York, and he came back by the train. He left his car in Natchez and eventually to Jackson. And Eudora and her friends, Nash Berger and Hubert Creekmore, took him around and about. They took him past the lunatic asylum, which was being vacated at the time, and they took him to Windsor, to the Windsor ruins. And he mentions both of those places in The Air-Conditioned Nightmare. He does not mention Eudora Welty or Nash Berger or Hubert Creekmore, but he mentions the two places in passing. So here we have Henry Miller. Oh, by the way, there is another funny story about Henry Miller and Jackson. And this too is really extraneous. But anyway, every night, because Mrs. Welty wouldn't have him at the house, they took him to the rotisserie, which was at 5 Points. And the rotisserie had a number of, it's a place called 5 Points. It's going to have a number of entrances. And they took him in a different entrance each time. And after he left, he wrote back to thank Eudora for her hospitality and said it was amazing that Jackson had so many fine restaurants. A town the size of Jackson had so many fine restaurants. And she thought that was typical because she said she thought he was the most boring man she had ever met, just kind of unobservant kind of person. Well, he didn't know what kind of restaurants he had been in, that's for sure, which one restaurant he had been in. So anyway, having Henry Miller, the prospect of a visit from Henry Miller, then a visit from Henry Miller. So probably before his visit, she writes, but anticipating it, she's writing The Purple Hat. After his visit, she writes Asphodel. She's taken him to the ruins of Windsor. There's a naked man cavorting on the, perhaps at the ruins of Windsor. So we have all of this. And then The Purple Hat is a very suggestive story. We have all of this that may be linked, may be inspired by the prospect and the actuality of a visit from Henry Miller. So I don't know, but that's something to think about. This is not a Natchez Trace story. This is a book of stories strung along the Natchez Trace, but it is, New Orleans is a place that if you were in the 19th century headed down the Natchez Trace, you might be going on to New Orleans, or if you're coming up from New Orleans by the river, you might get off and come up on the Natchez Trace. So it's tangentially linked. Certainly, Jamie Lockhart and the Robber Bridegroom makes that journey, and Henry Miller had made that journey too. So we'll let it into our book of Natchez Trace stories. Okay, well, let's talk about the story. And I would like to start us out by talking about the fact that this is a story within a story. This is a story with two narrators. There is the author, Eudora Welty, and then there is the fat man who works as the armed observer walking the catwalk above the gambling establishment in New Orleans. And he's really the primary narrator. So I thought we might talk about him first and look at some passages and see what they tell us about him and what he tells us about the other characters in the story. So if it's all right with you, I'll start off with a passage on page 269, where he's talking about the woman who wears the purple hat. And he says, "Sure, she's one of those thousands of middle-aged women who come every day to the palace, would not be kept away by anything on earth. Most of them are dull enough, drab old creatures, all of them, walking in with their big black purses held wearily by the handles like suitcases packed for a trip. No one has ever been able to find out how all these old creatures can leave their lives at home like that to gamble, what their husbands think, who keeps the house in order, who pays. At any rate, she is one like the rest, except for the hat, and except for the young man that always meets her there from year to year. And I think she is a ghost." Okay, so let's start with that passage. And what does that tell us about the man who's narrating it here? What do you hear in his voice? Anyone want to start us off? I could call, shall I call on someone? Joellen, I know you have something to say here.
Beverly has her hand up too.
Okay.
I think it's maybe hard to comment on that paragraph without noting that just kind of who he is. And he seems to be a kind of hard-boiled narrator. It was in a bar. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There was a bartender. And
but that's not that, that's Welty, isn't it? That's the author.
Well, it is. Yeah. That's true. But she's kind of framing him for us.
But I think hard-boiled, this is her hard-boiled detective story.
Yeah, it kind of sets us up for that. But then she comments on the bartender's baby pink nose, the fat man's really helpless looking hands for so large a man, so short and plump. So she undercuts that, and we realize we're in a kind of parodic world. And then let's see, where does the fat man first speaks? Then rain or shine, she'll be there. Setting up a kind of mystery. The bartender doesn't speak, but he stops his cloth, so that keeps the conversation going. And then finally we get to, sure, she's one of those thousands of middle-aged women who come to the palace every day. And so he comments on middle-aged women as drab, how they can spend all that time at the bar. But this one is like the rest, except for the hat and for the young man. So he's kind of spinning his wheels in a storytelling fashion.
I kind of, speaking as a formerly middle-aged woman before I became an elderly one, I resent that.
Yeah.
One of those middle-aged women, like one of the thousands of middle-aged women who come every day would not be kept away. They're dull. They're drab old creatures. They're big black purses, there's that kind of hostility, it seems to me, for middle-aged women. I don't know that this guy is affable looking, but he's affable looking. And I think there's a question of appearance and what his attitude toward women is. Yeah, Katie. And then I'll come back to Beverly. Okay.
Okay, so with this particular paragraph, I would just reiterate that's one thing that I noticed. I don't know if the word I want is misogyny, but there's something strange about this particular narrator and middle-aged women. But the other thing I would point out is I've been tracking ellipses in Welty, which is another story. But I was struck by the sheer number of ellipses in this story, and this paragraph is where I first started tracking it. If ellipses signify that which is left unsaid or cannot be said or is inexplicable, it's been omitted. There's a lot in this story, and this is where I feel like it first starts, is this particular paragraph.
Okay, so that his kind of delivery is halting. He's not saying everything he thinks. He's holding back something. Yeah. Elta.
Well, to state the obvious, the man is also a storyteller.
Yeah.
He clearly has a story to tell that he wants to tell. He's thought about this character. I mean, to speculate on her life at home, who pays the bills, that's he's quite interested, but he's a storyteller and he's trying to engage his audience. It's tantalizing what he has to say. But he's a raconteur too.
Oh yeah, I think that's important too. Yeah, that he is the raconteur. David?
I think he's kind of a Carney Barker type too. I mean, if you believe this is not really a ghost story, but that he's, trying to get this guy at the bar to go to the place, that he's spinning a tale. He's kind of a Carney Barker. He's kind of like bringing people into the show.
All right, yeah. Does he know, do you think, that the young man there is the young man who is meeting the lady in the purple hat? Is he trying to manipulate him perhaps too, do you think? So that he wouldn't be necessarily the Barker, but he's almost sort of asking him to kill her. I mean, isn't it? I don't know. Beverly?
The part that you read, where she's called middle-aged, and then thousands of middle-aged women, old creatures. Then on the next page, he says, I have seen this old and disgusting creature in her purple hat every night. So the contempt that he has for her, I mean, my question was, not was she a ghost, but was she real at all? I mean, had he seen a woman who sort of looked like this, and then he just grew that into a story? He can't even seem to get straight his description of her. I mean, to me, middle-aged, describing her as middle-aged and describing her as old are two very different things.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big questions we have, is what is real and what is not. Now, also, I want to point out too, he says that, what should women be doing? I mean, he's talking about what should they be doing? They should be home. What would their husbands think? Who keeps the house in order? Who pays? So, or shouldn't she be at home doing what women are supposed to do, keeping house, following what their husbands want? Alex. Oops, we're not hearing you, Alex.
Thank you. Sorry. Finally, one more thing. Welty is such a great writer of dialogue, and he's the main character as far as dialogue in this story. But most of this this particular paragraph does not sound like a human in the South would say it. Write it maybe, but not say it. Most of them are dull enough. All of them walking in with their big black purses held wearily. That adverb, people don't really talk like that, especially men who have jobs like that. And I wonder why Welty does this from time to time. That's just my only comment.
Anyone want to talk about that? I mean, I think Elta's point is he is a raconteur. And this is a story I think he's told before and will tell again. And he's worked it out. I mean, I don't know. I think of especially with the ellipses that Katie was pointing to, that does make it seem more kind of spontaneous,
Yes.
less set. Yeah. Let's look at a description of him that we get of him on 270. He describes himself. "Who are you?" asked the young man. And here's his answer. "Who are you?" And he says, "In the palace of pleasure, there's a little catwalk along beneath the dome," said the fat man. His rather small, mournful lips, such as big men often have, now parted in a vague smile. "I am the man whose eyes look out over the gambling room. I am the armed man that everyone knows to be watching at all they do. I don't believe my position is dignified by a title." Nevertheless, he looked rather pleased. "I have watched her every day for 30 years, and I think she's a ghost. I have seen her murdered twice," said the fat man. The bartender's enormous, sad black eyebrows raised like hoods on baby carriages and showed his round eyes. The fat man lifted his other fat little hand and studied, or rather showed off, a ruby ring that he wore on his little finger. That carpet, if you've ever been there in the Palace of Pleasure, is red, but from up above it changes and gives off lights between the worn crisscrossings of the aisles, like the facets of a well-cut ruby, he said, speaking in a declarative manner, as if he had been waiting for a chance to deliver this enviable comparison. "The tables and chandeliers are far down below me, points in its interior, life in the ruby. And yet somehow all that people do is clear and lucid and authentic there, as if it were magnified in the red lens, not made smaller. I can see everything in the world from my catwalk. You mustn't think I brag." He looked all at once from his ring straight at the young man's face, which was as drained and white as ever, expressionless, with a thin drop of whiskey running down his cheek where he had blundered with his glass. So what about this self-definition that he gives of himself? And what about his ruby ring? Why is he so focused on that ring? Any speculation here? Cheryl?
I don't know what the ruby signifies, but on the second or third reading of the story, the fat man's observations became so much more clear to me, especially this passage that you just read, but then at the end, and he uses his power, not like a god, I guess, but as a patronly figure in the pleasure palace, having been able to observe everything, to act as a guide and a caution type person, if that makes sense.
It does to me. I mean, I sort of think of him as the Dr. T.J. Eckelberg of this story. If you think about The Great Gatsby and those eyes looking out at everything. And here he's up in the catwalk watching. And he likes to think he's in control too, doesn't he? He sees everything through the perspective of the ring, life in the ruby, magnified in its red lens. And I don't know, I think of that ring as a kind of like a princely ring that maybe people would kiss, and it's his only sense of his own power, and he sees everything through the lens of his own power, it seems to me, but I don't know. What do you make of that idea? Am I off on a wild tangent here? David?
I think that description, especially in other places too, I think he makes it an intriguing and enticing place, a place that you want to go, whether you think you
Yeah.
probably shouldn't or not.
Yeah, that's called the Palace of Pleasure. And Jessica just asked me before we started, was there really a Palace of Pleasure in New Orleans? And there were gambling casinos, but I hadn't even looked it up. I looked it up just before you all arrived on my phone, and I didn't find one, but there were lots of casinos there. So that she's chosen that name, and he talks about it too as this enticing, seductive place. Yeah. Anything else about him up there on his little catwalk, watching everything, seeing things from his own lens? Cheryl?
Yes, ma'am. I'm still kind of new to the book club, so I don't like what I want to point out is on the last page, and I don't know if that's
Sure, go ahead.
appropriate yet.
Go ahead. I like when you take it away from me.
Just and again, this didn't occur to me until subsequent readings, but when after the young man leaves and the fat man gets up and he says, up on the catwalk, you get the feeling now and then that you could put out your finger and make a change in the universe. His great shoulders lifted. And so that completely changes my thinking of what his motivation is. I think he followed this young man into the bar. He knew his routines. He's aware of the, I guess, nefarious kind of role that the purple hat lady has, and he wants to counsel him. He wants to give him warning, but because it's a younger man who's already caught up in some sort of frenzy, whatever this attraction is, the power that the purple hat lady has over all of these men, he can't address it directly. He has to pretend to be talking to the bartender about a story and let the young man start to figure it out himself.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes he says you get the feeling that you could put out your finger and make a change in the universe. And at another point, he calls the Palace of Pleasure the world. Here, I see the world. I've got it. And there is that sense that he really is manipulating and trying to control and shape the course of events. Yeah. I don't know your first name. Rose.
Kathy.
Kathy, go Kathy.
Kathy. Yes, I felt almost like he was seductive, that he had come into the bar and he had to get everyone's attention. The fact that they sat at opposite ends of the bar and he addressed the bartender, but he clearly wanted the attention of the young man. So I almost read this as though he was trying to procure that young man for the ghost. And the fact that at the end of the story, he almost feels like a ghost himself, that he's trying to seduce or draw that young man into that palace of pleasure. I also felt like the red alleyways of the palace itself are almost like the heart or a living thing that he was trying to draw the young man into.
Yeah, he says that the woman in the purple hat is seducing him, leading him on, but he's doing it as well. Yeah, David and then Helen.
Yeah, I agree with everything Cheryl said up to the point of, I don't think he was trying to warn him. I think he was trying to lure him. I think he wanted him to go there. I think if he were trying to warn him, he could be more plain in what he was saying. I think he was trying to make it, seductive, intriguing, enticing. He was trying to lure him there, I think. Procure, although I don't think the woman was a ghost, but
yeah, I think what he's looking for is somebody to come and kill her the third time. Let's see. I'll tell you if she's a ghost after this tomorrow. I'll tell you. Yeah, Helen.
Just wanted to comment on his physical position here in the room. Welty constructed this where he is in the position of a puppeteer. And as you just said, he's the fact that he can pull or push or he feels in control, just as he feels in control and sitting there at the bar and telling the story. But anyway, that's all.
Yeah, I was talking to Harriet Pollock about this the other day, and she said it reminded her in a way of John Merle in the A Still Moment, who tells stories, and he makes his victims characters in the story, and find the story ends with the death, and so that kind of manipulation. Someone else had a hand up, I think. Shall we look at the description of the lady on 271? And then we'll look again on 272. In 30 years, she has not changed, said the fat man. Neither has she changed her hat. Dear God, how the moths must have hungered for that hat. But she has kept it in full bloom on her head, that monstrosity, purple too, as if she were beautiful in the bargain. She has not aged, but she keeps her middle age. The young man, on the other hand, must change. I'm sure he's not always the same young man. For 30 years, he said, she's met a young man at the dice table every afternoon, rain or shine, at 5 o'clock, and gambles till midnight and tells him goodbye, and it still looks to be always the same young man, always young, but with a little stale, a little tired, the smudge of a sideburn. She finds them, she does, she picks them. Where, I don't know, unless New Orleans, as I've always had a guess, is the birthplace of ready-made victims. So there's that description. And then on 271 at the bottom of the page, it's time I told you about the hat. It's quite a hat, a great, wide, deep hat, such as has no fashion and never knew there was fashion and change. It serves her to come out in winter and summer. Those are old plush flowers that trim it. Roses, poppies, a man wouldn't know easily. And you would never know if you'd only met her wearing that hat, that a little glass vial with a plunger helps decorate the crown. You would have to see it from above, or you would need to be the young man sitting beside her at the gambling table when, at some point in the evening, she takes the hat off and lays it carefully in her lap under the table. Then you might notice the little vial and be attracted to it and wish to take it out and examine it at your pleasure off in the washroom, to admire the handle, for instance, which is red glass like the petals of an artificial flower. Try to imagine, the fat man was saying gently to the bartender. At some point in the evening, she always takes off the purple hat. Usually it is very late, when it is almost time for her to go. The young man who has come to the rendezvous watches her until she removes it, watches her hungrily. Is it in order to see her hair? Well, most ghosts that are lovers and lovers that are ghosts have the long, thick black hair that you would expect, and hers is no exception to the rule. It's pinned up, of course, in her strange, straggly, vague way, but the young man doesn't look at it after all. He is enamored of her hat, her ancient, battered, outrageous hat with the awful plush flowers. She lays it down below the level of the table, there on her shabby old lap, and he caresses it. Well, I suppose in this town there are stranger forms of love than that. And who are any of us to say what ways people may not find love? She herself, you know, seems perfectly satisfied with it. And yes, she must not be satisfied, being a ghost. Does it matter how she seeks her desire? I'm sure she speaks to him in a sort of purr, the purr that is used for talking in that room. And the young man does not know what she seeks of him, and she is leading him on all the time. What does she say? I do not know, but believe me, she leads him on. Okay, there is one suggestive passage. What, anyone want to talk about this? These lines? What's going on here? Joe Ellen. Oops, we can't hear you.
Okay, I'll take a crack at it. He's clearly the one leading on. And who knows whether there's a woman there who wears a big purple hat with flowers. but he's been pulling in his audience, reeling him in all the way along. He certainly could recognize the young man's type in the bar, but early on, he starts using it, same like the ellipses. By the bottom of 271, he starts repeating you, pulling his listeners in. And you would never know, or you would need to be, then you might notice, or did you know, you see, stranger for, anyway, throughout, he's just you. And he's clearly trying to manipulate the younger man, whether he plants the idea of drugs with a syringe in a lady's hat that might be killed for, or just, who knows exactly what he's setting up. But I would say he's not at all a reliable narrator.
All right. So here we have him as the seducer in a sense here. What else? All of this stuff about the hat and the vial, and then later we find out about the long hat pin.
In the chat, John Browning mentioned in that passage, we have shifting perspectives from micro to macro and recursion. So he thought those were interesting motifs. And he was also asking about the pin and how ladies have purple hat clubs now, and might they have been inspired by this story?
All right, Annette.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
It is the most unusual, fabulously symbolic hat. Is so much about fetishism. It's sort of like fetishizing an accoutrement of a woman. She keeps it in her lap.
Yeah.
He's interested in the rest of the woman. He's interested in that fabulously alluring, fetishistic hat that's both floral and feminine. But then there's also this kind of interesting vial. I don't know what y'all make of the vial. That is a very interesting form and suggestive of all sorts of things. I'm stopping right here.
All right, I know I don't know where to go either, Annette, but I was going to say, to me, it's strange that a vial is, to me, I would usually say it had a stopper, but this one has a plunger. And it seems to me that plunger must be pretty significant. And the hat pin is another sort of phallic symbol. And then I don't know what to make of it, but the narrator says that, that vial with the plunger, he'd like to take it into the washroom and look at it. Well, why is that? What about that washroom? Your mind can go a lot of places with this. And then he says, what if the vial is empty? And I do think there's a suggestion of drugs, as Joel Ellen says too, but then I think it's also the hat on her lap, beneath the table, the fondling of the hat on her lap. It's suggestive of her sexuality, and then the two phallic kind of things that are in the hat, and the narrator obsessing about it, so what's going on here? What do you think? Are Annette and I just dirty old women? The other thing is, she's an old woman, and he's offended that it's the old woman who attracts the young man. This is not right. It should be a young woman that should be the attractive one, and he's offended. It's almost as if he's offended by her sexuality and her attractiveness to the young man, if there is a woman. Alec.
Right, all that's true. And finally, as far as the architecture of this story, as in so many Welty stories, there's a balance. Two men are on opposite ends of 6 stools, and he even says that little vial balances off something else that's on top of the hat. And woman, man, old woman, young man. There's elements of a balance in this story, and I kind of point that out.
All right, yeah, the carefully structured story in that way. Beverly?
Well, she's not an old woman.
No.
I mean, he says
he calls her that. Yeah.
Yeah, she's been there 30 years. Yeah. but she hasn't changed in those 30 years. So this could be a 40-year-old cougar with a 25-year-old, kid that's at the casino with her. So when we view it, when he's saying how disgusting she is, and here is this old, disgusting woman, he's told us several times that she wears her middle age well. She has not changed. So I think, when we look at the story, if we look at it as being real and the fact that she's not a ghost and she's managed to survive 30 years, he tells us again and again, she is not old. And so, her hanging out in a casino, which is not my thing, but, if it were, when I was 40, and picked up a 25 or 30-year-old, which I also would never do. Let me just go on record as saying that. But I think that he, in his description of her, he is wavering in what he has told us at the beginning, that she's middle-aged. She is not an 80-year-old woman picking up a 25-year-old guy.
Yeah. He makes it pretty clear that she's attractive, but then he says, she's so big, it takes 3 men to carry her out. This from the fat man. So there's this kind of hostility, I think. Yeah. Joe Ellen and then David.
I see the underlying sexualization, but it seems to me that's a way of luring in an addict. I mean, I think he has spotted his guy who can hardly speak. I think the only thing he says is, "Who are you?" But he's drinking, and as soon as 5 o'clock strikes, he's off. So that's a kind of suggestion that this scenario really does happen. But clearly the vial is going off with the young man. But what he sets him up by saying is that, but you hate this woman because the vial might be empty, more or less. So there's all of that stuff going on. But
he does his description of him is sort of like he's on something as well. He has 3 drinks really quickly, and then
yeah, like he's waiting for it to open or her to get there or something.
Yeah.
But then there's really not a sexualized part of it where she's leaving with anybody. At most, he's stroking the hat because he wants to take off with the vial. She goes home at night after playing. So it doesn't seem to me that there's sex involved exactly, except the lure of something else. But I just want to toss this out there. I could not read this story without thinking of Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. And I haven't read that for years. I don't know, I can't even remember who was telling the story about, there are 2 different ways to read that, as a ghost story or an extremely manipulative story that's driving some people crazy. And I lean toward the Turn of the Screw reading of this, that the fat man is a pot stirrer, call it the worst word if you like, that he's trying to set something up. And is the woman really a ghost? The bartender asks, "I'll tell you tomorrow, whether anything came of this."
Yeah. And that's what David was pointing to, I think. Isn't that right, David? That he's the huckster, and he's pushing this.
Yeah, I was wondering if Welty ever explained the story or talked about it, or in general, if she did that with many of her stories at all. If people the discussions we're having, like, what did this mean? What did this mean? Did she talk much about her stories, and this one in particular?
Well, I hate to confess this, but I talk to her all the time about her stories, and I never ask her about it. I ask her about all kinds of stories, but I never ask about this one. And not too much has been written about it. And I don't think in the conversation she does mention it, but she mentions it sort of dismissively. And so I think, no. Does anybody know more than I in this one? Joe Ellen?
I really don't, except that I have seen virtually nothing about it. But I just want to ask, I'm sorry that both Harriet and Jacob are gone, but do other participants—
They're all in Atlanta at the SSSL.
Southern Literature Society. But does anyone else who has taken part in the book that's coming out next January on Welty and Mystery know whether the Purple Hat is dealt with?
No,
mean, surely it
they
is.
both are sorry. It's not in the book.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, maybe it's
Interesting.
not too late. I don't know.
Oh, I think it's too late, but that's interesting in itself.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
a lot
I
of
think-
comment. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jessica.
There's comments in the chat that are really looking at symbolism of drug use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think these are two possible interpretations. The sexual one, and I was seeing it as the man thinking, okay, the woman leads him on, but she doesn't take him home. She's not playing fair here. You know, it's this kind of, I'm going to impose the role of women on her. But I think the drug use is also a very viable one as well. So there's, and then we have the question of, is this a ghost story or isn't it a ghost story? Should we talk about that? Is this a ghost? Is there a ghost or isn't it? Cheryl, we'll go where you want to go first.
No, that's actually exactly what I had raised my hand about, is because Dr. Marrs, I think like right at the beginning, you said that this collection of stories was supposed to be about the Natchez Trace, right? To introduce that area of Mississippi to the country. But then Welty chooses to have a story set in New Orleans. And I think that New Orleans is associated with the supernatural, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why, because of the setting, I think it pretty much has to be a ghost story, because it's specifically, out of all the other stories, it's specifically set in New Orleans.
Now, we could say that Asphodel could be a kind of ghost story. I mean, is this a ghost that they see at the end, or is he still alive?
True.
And of course, there could be stories in New Orleans that aren't ghost stories, but her other story that's really focused on New Orleans, No Place for You, My Love, has been called a sort of ghost story. And you know, that, as Leota says, and about Mrs. Pike and Why I Live at the PO, she's from New Orleans and everybody there believes everything's spooky. So it's a fitting setting for a ghost story. If you're going to have a ghost story on the Natchez Trace, this is a fitting, or near the Natchez Trace, a fitting setting for it. Yeah. What else about it as a ghost story? This is when I teach beloved, people always want to know, well, why is Toni Morrison writing a ghost story? Yeah. So why is Eudora Welty writing a ghost story here, or is she? Why the evocation of the ghost? Cheryl, do you have your hand up?
No, I didn't mean to.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Off the hook.
Huh.
Joe Ellen. Whoops, we can't hear you.
Keep forgetting that. I was just going to say, in terms of conventions, the bartender is kind of a typical audience for a ghost story, a kind of pleasing terror. And, you know, he's sort of responds and keeps it going. And not until the end does he actually ask, is she really a ghost? There's no gratuitous blood, that kind of, no explanation of how things might have worked. But it strikes me that the conventions that this really follows more, but that Welty's just mixing things up, is that and noir fiction really hadn't started, but hard-boiled detective fiction had been published in pulps and noir films during the 1930s. And I think she's kind of pulling a potential ghost into a kind of noirish story, dark New Orleans, etc. But that's, but I mean, I think it's a setup. I think she's having fun with it, with all of the conventions, like some of the description, but it's a kind of noir parody to me more than ghost story.
All right. Katie, you've written about pulp fiction a good bit. What do you think?
About it as a kind of mystery? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I like the idea of the reading. I mean, it has, you know, the ingredients of the drug usage, I'm wondering if the fat man has actually been rejected by her, and that's maybe part of the narrative, that he's not disclosing if there's some kind of rejection narrative to tease out of this. I don't know, just brainstorming.
All right. I'm thinking of two of ghost stories. If we think of it as a ghost story, that he tells this ghost story. Ghost stories are about being haunted. And what is he being haunted by? Is he being haunted by some idea? And I think maybe by a sense of his own impotence. He wants to be the all-powerful man looking down, controlling the course of events, but he can't, or by a sense of the woman as her sexuality is threatening to him. Or does he doubt the reality of a woman who can break the boundaries that he describes her as breaking? Are these things, is it real or not real? Are these the kind of issues that involved? Annette? My partner in crime here.
Yes, indeed. I was actually just also going to talk about the hauntedness, and the function, like when do ghosts arise? They arise when there is something that happened that we silence, or we don't talk about, or that we, like there are ghosts of history that sort of come. And so I think this sort of haunted quality might have to do with the fact that, certain things in the palace of pleasure cannot be real. They cannot actually be admitted into our daytime life. I'm not sure. So then there's this ghost-like kind of figure, and they're ghosted, and people are haunted by things that happen in the palace of pleasure. And on the one hand, our fat man is sort of enshrining the lady as the eternal feminine, it seems to me. She never dies. She's a ghost that haunts everybody. At the same time, she's also really, possibly even I'm suggesting this wildly now to this entire group, but even a woman, there is all of this phallic imagery, as Dr. Marrs has pointed out, and this sort of like, androgynous quality, and this, Welty is fabulous at being totally ambiguous. On the one hand, given us this eternal female principle that these men in the bar are haunted by. On the other hand, making her this forbidden, strange, interesting, creature with a vial and a plunger. I stop right there, but maybe there's a reason for this to be just better and safer as a ghost story.
Well, I think the Palace of Pleasure is an interesting name for this. And I don't think there was a real Palace of Pleasure, but palace, the idea of power, and the man with his ruby ring. But then she has the purple hat, the color purple, the regal, powerful color. Where is power going to reside, and where does pleasure reside? So the questions of pleasure and of power and relationships between the sexes as they are played out here, or pleasure as maybe non-existent, artificially induced through drugs, through gambling. And I've also seen gambling as just sort of a metaphor for experience in general, game of chance that we play out all our lives. Jo Ellen?
I'm just responding to Annette a little bit.
Yeah.
She said, when do ghosts arise? Are there historical circumstances that get repressed? And I'm going to share one observation. I didn't take me very far before you hit a wall, but her hat and the woman have not changed in 30 years. So that would have been just pre-World War I. Perhaps remnants of an Edwardian society being responded against. The young man purportedly would be younger than the damaged veterans coming back from World War I. But anyway, he makes that 30 years clear. And so that's the time period when the woman would have been middle-aged, and at least her hat from.
Yeah, thank you. All right, what else? What about the time that she's writing it, 1941, February 1941? Is that significant here, do you think? Cheryl?
In relation to the combination, Joe Ellen in the chat pointed out the femme fatale aspect of things, but with this being, because it triggered the thought of when you said February 1941, of the Rosie the Riveter movement and women being able to publicly embrace like the physical strength that they had. And so there's this combination for the lady in the purple hat. She represents the feminine in a way, because the fat man does describe her face. He says her face spreads over such a wide area, like the moons. So the moon and lunar and feminine. And she has a deadly, I think, oversized hat pen, 10 to 12 inches long, but it's jeweled, like a woman would want a jeweled hat pen as opposed to just a plain sword-like weapon. And the plunger has a flowered petal handle, which is, so again, something deadly, but it's been feminized with the flowered petal.
Yeah. I think this probably is before the move for women to enter the workforce after the war started, but it's certainly when the war is raging in Europe before we're in it.
Okay.
And thinking about those kind of issues of power, I think would be, and abuses of power and manipulation of people might be relevant here. Think anyone? So if we're going to sum up this story, if you were going to write an essay about it, where would you start? Elta, I'm going to come back to you with your idea of this man as narrator.
Well, actually, I didn't have a clue. I was thinking about the paper, but you know, I don't know about New Orleans in 1941, but when we lived there in the 60s, it was already, these palaces of pleasure were quite tawdry places. And so, you know, there's that whole unsavory thing. But palace of pleasure is such a misnomer for what those places were like. And, you know, and I was thinking about a woman who doesn't change in 30 years. There was this famous stripper down there. I can't think of her name. All that comes to my mind is Stormy Daniels, and I know that's not she, but there's some incredible stripper who is older than I am and apparently is still at it down there. So, you know, that whole sense, and I think that the atmosphere is compressed here, but it's quite layered with all of the allure, but also the tawdriness. That fat man is a very off-putting character for someone who's trying to draw people in. So all of that is very confused. Sorry.
Yeah. Martha. Oh, I'm so happy to hear your voice today, Martha.
No, you're very kind. You know, one of the things that struck me, and this may be totally off base, is this whole idea of memory. And that what struck me is it really the same woman? Or has the fat man just sort of amalgamated his observations over these many years? And that there is a character, and there is like this woman, and they wear a hat sometimes, or a young man. And that scenario has played itself out so many times over his watching from the catwalk over this gambling casino. But is it really the same person? That was just.
I think that's another important point here too, because here's the raconteur. To what extent are the stories he tells, are the memories he recounts real? What extent are they created? What is real and what is not real? And that typical Welty question about the nature of storytelling and of memory. Yeah, Alec?
You'll already think I'm crazy, so I'll go ahead and jump right in. In the period before we entered World War II, there were forces in the United States, including President Roosevelt himself, that were trying to lure the United States into war. You could think of the fat man as Roosevelt or as Churchill. And a lot of young men, obviously, in every war, want to sign up. And at this point in our lives, right now, 2022, we would say, what the hell for? What good have we done, you know, in the wars in my lifetime? But anyway, the thing of luring into war, Eudora Welty was not unaware of what all was going on in the world.
I would say, though, this is a war fought against Adolf Hitler and against anti-Semitism, against all kinds of racism, all kinds of belittling of people for a myriad of reasons. And that the fat man, to me, the fat man's attitudes are more sort of fascistic than they are ones that would be luring people into war. That he's the kind of person, especially in his attitude toward women, is dismissive, threatened, vindictive. So anyway, so I would argue against you there, Alec, but I do think that when you're writing in a particular moment of history, and it's bound to have some kind of impact on you. Yeah, Jo Ellen.
I mean, is it possible that with her plays, I mean, there's a big element of parody and even comedy in this story,
Yeah.
but that Welty on some level is taking the hard-boiled tradition and its attitudes toward women and Noir's characters, reducing them. Our characters are a fat man and a middle-aged woman, not exactly your ordinary jaundiced detective and the scheming femme fatale, but they're really reduced. But you see the same kind of contempt toward the woman and reduction of women characters. I think I think that aspect, in that aspect, we're right on.
Yeah. I also want to take to heart Elta's description of the pleasure palaces as being kind of tawdry, ugly, not as particularly attractive establishments. And I think that fits with what you're saying as well, that kind of parody of the pleasure palace. Yeah. All right. Any last comments? Let's see, we've got 2 minutes. Anyone want to make a last comment here? Sum up? Corrective? Beverly?
This isn't a comment really, but when I was looking for information on this story, I found references to Noel Polk having written about it as far as misogyny went and stuff like that. But there's also, I put in the chat, I came across a film. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I didn't watch it because I didn't want to be influenced before the discussion. But there is a film of the Purple Hat.
There is, and I think you can watch it online. It was
you
made,
can.
It was made at the what's the name of the hotel where the Carousel Bar is? The Monteleone.
Monteleone.
Yeah, and so the Monteleone, because Eudora had always stayed there, sort of commissioned this film, and it was done. So it would be interesting to talk about it, how they handled. And I can't remember, Beverly. I remember watching it, but I don't remember it vividly. So, but I do think talking about what's done in film versus the story is always pretty interesting. But I'm like you, I don't want to do it before I do the story. So there's that could be an extra bit of homework for next time. Look at the film of the Purple Hat. Yeah. All right, Jessica, what we have next time, we have Livy. And
we have Livy next time.
And are we meeting on Monday, or we're meeting a week from Monday, are we not?
So we are off for the 4th of July, and we'll discuss Livy on July 11th.
All right, very good. See you July 11th. Bye-bye.